My name is Eleanor Matthews. I'm 70 years old, and my son served me legal papers at my own husband's funeral, demanding half of the 1,500-acre orchard we built from dust. So, I found a way to give our life's work to everyone in the world except him. It's a long story, but one I feel I have to tell. I'm sitting here on my porch as the sun sets, the sky painted in shades of orange and purple that Richard always loved. It makes me feel a little closer to him. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Let me know in the comments. It makes the world feel a little smaller, a little friendlier. The scent of lilies inside the funeral home was suffocating, a sweet, cloying perfume that clung to the heavy silence. It felt wrong. Pinewood Orchard, our life, smelled of damp earth, crisp apples, and blossoming flowers. Richard was a man of the soil, not of this sterile, hushed room. He would have hated it. He lay in the polished oak casket, looking like a stranger in a suit he wore only for weddings, and now his own final departure. His hands, the same powerful hands that had grafted thousands of saplings and could fix any engine, were folded over his chest, still and pale. The sight of them, so devoid of life, was a physical blow that stole the air from my lungs again and again. For 51 years, those hands had been my anchor. Now I was adrift. Friends, neighbors, and fellow farmers from across the valley filed past, their faces a blur of sympathy. Their words were kind, meant to be comforting, but they were like raindrops on a tin roof, a hollow, repetitive sound that couldn't penetrate the storm of my grief. He was a good man, Eleanor, a pillar of the community. I'm so sorry for your loss. I would nod, my lips forming a silent thank you that felt like a lie. How could I thank them for acknowledging the gaping hole that had been torn in the fabric of my universe? My old friend, Martha Peterson, squeezed my hand, her touch warm and real. "How are you holding up, dear?" she whispered, her eyes magnified by her thick glasses swimming with genuine tears. "I'm breathing, Martha. For now, that's enough." It was then, as Martha moved away, that a chill snaked down my spine, a cold premonition that had nothing to do with my loss. I looked towards the entrance and there he was, my son, Marcus. 6 years. 6 years of silence, of birthdays and holidays marked by his absence. 6 years since he had stormed out of our lives, leaving a wound that never truly healed. And now he stood there not as a son returning to mourn his father, but as an outsider, an observer. He was flanked by a woman I'd never seen before, a sharp, blonde icicle of a woman whose expensive black dress seemed more like a statement of power than a garment of mourning. Her eyes weren't sad, they were assessing. They swept the room, lingering on the floral arrangements, the number of guests, as if calculating the value of the man in the casket. Marcus had changed. The boyish softness was gone, replaced by a hard set to his jaw and a coldness in his eyes that mirrored his companions'. He didn't look at the casket. He didn't look for me. He simply stood at the back, a dark, unwelcome specter at his own father's farewell. William Thompson, our lawyer for 40 years and a man who was more brother than friend to Richard, materialized at my side. His presence was a bulwark against the sudden tide of dread. "Eleanor," he murmured, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. "What in God's name is he doing here?" "I don't know, Will," I whispered back, my voice trembling for the first time that day. "But I don't think he's here to grieve." The service began, a haze of scripture and song. The pastor's eulogy was beautiful, filled with anecdotes of Richard's quiet generosity. How he'd plowed a neighbor's field after a storm, how he'd given away bushels of apples to the local food bank every year without ever seeking recognition. Every word was a fresh stab of pain, a reminder of the man the world had lost, the man our son had seemingly forgotten. Through it all, I felt Marcus's stare like a physical weight from the back of the room. It wasn't a look of sorrow. It was a look of impatience. After the final amen, as the organ played a somber recessional, people began to move towards me again, but Marcus cut them off. He strode down the aisle, his girlfriend gliding behind him. The hushed, respectful atmosphere curdled as he approached. He stopped a few feet from me, creating an impassable gulf. "Mother," he said, the word an accusation. He didn't offer a hand, a hug, a single word of condolence. He gestured to a small, ornate table nearby, where a guest book lay open. With a deliberate, almost theatrical motion, he placed a thick, legal-sized manila envelope on the polished wood. The thud it made was obscene in the sacred quiet. "I didn't want to cause a scene," he announced, his voice just loud enough for the half-dozen people closest to us to hear. The Petersons, who had been waiting to offer me a ride home, froze mid-step. Their faces registered shock, then a slow dawning horror. "But this is a matter of some urgency. Half of this orchard, this entire estate, is my rightful inheritance. Those are the legal papers to begin the process." The world tilted. The lilies, the murmuring guests, the stained glass windows, it all swam in a dizzying vortex. I gripped the back of a nearby pew to steady myself. The woman, Jessica, gave a thin, reptilian smile. "It's just business, Eleanor," she said, her voice like ice water. "Marcus is simply claiming what is legally his by birthright. It's time he received his due for his father's promotion to the afterlife, so to speak." The calmness of her words, the use of a term like promotion at a funeral, was so shocking, it was clarifying. It cut through my grief like a shard of glass. William, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, stepped in front of me. "Marcus, have you taken complete leave of your senses? This is your father's funeral. Show some respect." "Respect?" Marcus scoffed, a bitter, ugly sound. "Respect is what he denied me my entire life, always putting this farm, this dirt, before his own son. I'm done waiting. I'm done being respectful." He looked past William, his cold eyes locking on mine. "My lawyer's card is in the envelope. Your lawyer has a week to contact him. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." He turned on his heel and walked away, Jessica falling into step beside him, a smug, proprietary hand on his arm. They didn't look back. They simply left a wake of scandalized whispers and stunned silence. Martha Peterson looked as if she might faint. Her husband, Tom, looked ready to commit murder. William's hand was a firm, grounding pressure on my shoulder. "The boy has no soul," he breathed, his voice shaking with rage. I looked from the hateful yellow envelope to the casket. My Richard. My kind, gentle, hard-working Richard. He had given his life to that land, to our family, and this was the thanks he received? This was the eulogy delivered by his only child. In that moment, something inside me shifted. The soft, weeping wound of grief began to cauterize, to harden. A cold, clear, and unbendable resolve began to form in the hollow space where my heart had been. He had come to his father's funeral not to mourn a life, but to claim a property. He had mistaken my grief for weakness. He had mistaken my love for his father as a vulnerability he could exploit. He was about to learn, in the hardest way possible, how wrong he was. This was no longer about a son's inheritance. This was about a wife's honor. The farmhouse that night was a tomb of memories. Every shadow seemed to hold Richard's shape. Every gust of wind sounded like his sigh. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sit still. The image of that envelope on the table was burned into my mind. Grief was a physical weight, but betrayal was a fire, and it was fueling a restless energy inside me that demanded action. I found myself in Richard's study, a room that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco and Old Spice aftershave. My eyes were drawn to the storage closet, a place I hadn't entered in years. I knew what was inside. I knew what Richard had put there on that terrible day 6 years ago. My hand trembled as I turned the old brass knob. The closet was cool and dark. In the corner, covered by an old canvas tarp, was a large cedar chest. Richard had built it to store our winter woolens, but its final purpose had become much sadder. It was a sarcophagus for our son's childhood. I dragged the heavy box into the middle of the room. The scent of cedar filled the air as I lifted the lid. And there it was. A life, packed away in layers. On top was a framed photo of a laughing, gap-toothed Marcus, aged 5, proudly holding up a string of sunfish he'd caught with Richard at Miller's Pond.
I remembered that day so clearly. The sun on our faces, the smell of lake water, the sheer, unadulterated joy in our son's eyes. He had been our world, the center of our universe. Every long day we spent in the orchard, every sacrifice we made was to build a future for that little boy. We weren't just building a business, we were building his foundation, his college fund, his launch pad into the world. My fingers sifted deeper, past a bundle of his childhood drawings, our house with a giant sun smiling over it, stick figures of Mama, Dada, and me holding hands. I found his Little League trophy, a bronze plastic boy swinging a bat. Richard had been his coach. He never missed a game, even if it meant working in the orchard by floodlight until midnight to catch up. How could Marcus forget that? How could that devotion curdle into such bitter resentment? Then I found the first signs of the shift. A letter from his sophomore year of college. The tone was different. Not the chatty, newsy letters from his freshman year, but a new entitled coolness. He complained about his dorm room, about his roommate, about his meager allowance. He compared his situation to that of his friends whose fathers were doctors and investment bankers. They don't have to work a summer job, he'd written. Their parents understand the importance of making connections. There was no mention of the fact that his meager allowance was something we'd sacrifice for, that his tuition was paid in full by calloused hands and aching backs. Beneath that was another letter, the one I remembered with a sickening lurch, the demand for $5,000 for a can't-miss tech investment. I remembered Richard's face when he'd gotten off the phone with the dean of students, having discovered the investment was a poker debt. The look on his face wasn't just anger, it was a deep, profound disappointment. It was the first time he realized the foundation we'd built for our son might be resting on sand. He paid the debt directly, a move Marcus saw as a controlling, unforgivable intrusion. The rift began there. The phone calls dwindled. The visits became obligations rather than joys. Finally, my fingers touched the source of the deepest pain. I pulled out the crisp, folded business proposal Marcus had brought with him on that last awful visit 6 years ago. The proposal to sell off the North 100 acres, the oldest part of the orchard, the part my own father had planted, to a developer who wanted to build luxury condos. The memory flooded back, sharp and agonizing. The slick, smiling developer, Marcus, pacing our kitchen, his voice tight with frustration. "It's a fortune, Mom. We could have a real salary, a professional life. You could finally stop killing yourselves for a bunch of trees." "It's not just trees, Marcus," I had said, my voice pleading. "It's our home. It's your heritage." "Heritage doesn't pay the bills," he'd yelled. And then, when I had stood firm, when I had refused to betray his grandfather's memory, the slap. The shocking, stinging impact, the look of stunned disbelief on Richard's face, followed by a cold, quiet fury that was more terrifying than any shouting. "Get out," Richard had said, his voice deadly calm. "Get out of our house and don't come back." After Marcus had gone, Richard had silently gathered every picture, every trophy, every drawing, and locked them in this chest. He never spoke of it again. He had performed a surgical amputation on his own heart. At the very bottom of the chest, I found something I'd never seen before, a long white envelope with my name on it, in Richard's familiar script. With trembling hands, I opened it. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I fear the boy has returned as I always knew he would, not as a son, but as a claimant. I saw the rot in him that day, Eleanor, the greed that had been planted by the world and that he had watered with his own bitterness. It broke my heart, but it did not blind me. That is why I went to see William the following week. This letter is to tell you what I have done. The will we wrote together is void. I have created a new will. In this new will, Eleanor, everything is yours. Every tree, every barn, every dollar in the bank. It is all yours, solely and Completely. I have also included a specific clause that makes my intentions clear. Marcus is to inherit nothing, not a single red cent, not a single fallen leaf. I know this is harsh, but he made his choice. He chose money over family. He chose greed over love. Use this will, my love. Use it as a shield to protect what we built. Use it as a sword to fight for our home. Do not let him win. Do not let him tear down the garden we tended together. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Yours always, Richard. The tears I had held back finally came, a hot, silent torrent. They weren't just tears of grief for my husband, but tears of gratitude for his foresight, his fierce, protective love that reached for me even from beyond the grave. He had given me a weapon, a cannon, as William would later call it. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. The fire of betrayal inside me was now forged with Richard's love into something unbreakable. A cold, hard certainty settled in my soul.
Marcus had come for a war over property. He had no idea he was about to face a crusade for honor, and I would not be the only one fighting on my side. I had Richard's final wish as my shield and his memory as my banner, and I would not fail him. The first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky when I finally picked up the phone. My voice was hoarse from unshed tears, but it was steady. "Will," I said when he answered, his own voice thick with sleep. "I'm sorry to call so early. I need to see you, as soon as possible." "Eleanor, are you all right?" "My office at 9. I'll have coffee ready." "I'll be there." I dressed with the deliberation of a general preparing for battle. Not in black, the color of mourning, but in a deep blue dress, the color of resolve. I fastened the simple strand of pearls Richard had given me, their cool weight against my skin, a comforting presence. Driving into town, the familiar landscape seemed different, sharper. Every fence post, every field, every barn was a part of the kingdom I now had to defend. William's office, with its comforting scent of leather and old paper, was a sanctuary of sanity in a world gone mad. He poured me a coffee, his kind eyes full of concern. He didn't press me, just waited for me to speak. I pushed Richard's letter across the desk. "Read this first." He read it in silence, his expression shifting from sympathy to grim understanding, and then to a kind of fierce satisfaction. When he finished, he looked up at me, his eyes glinting behind his spectacles. "Well," he said, a slow, grim smile touching his lips. "This is it, Eleanor. This is the canon. Richard was a smart man. This will is ironclad. We filed this with the probate court, we present it at the hearing, and Marcus's claim evaporates. It will be public, it will be ugly, and he will be humiliated. But it will be over." He leaned back, expecting me to feel a wave of relief, and a part of me did. The tired, grieving widow in me wanted to grasp this simple, powerful solution. It was a clean cut, a final, decisive victory handed to me by my husband. But as I looked at the letter, at Richard's loving, angry words, another thought began to take root. A thought that had been planted by his long-ago dream of the orchard becoming something more. I shook my head slowly. "No, Will." William's smile faded. He leaned forward, confused. "No? Eleanor, this is exactly what Richard wanted. He gave you the weapon to win this war." "I know he did," I said, my voice quiet but gaining a strange new strength. "But what kind of victory would that be? I'd win the farm, but I'd lose the last tiny shred of hope for my son. If I do this, he will spend the rest of his life hating his father, hating me, convinced he was a victim of a vindictive will. He'll be bitter and broken, but he will never, ever understand why. He won't learn the value of what he tried to take, only the pain of having it denied to him." I met William's gaze, my own eyes burning with a sudden fierce clarity. I don't want to destroy him, Will. I want to teach him. I want to build something that he can never touch, not because a will forbids it, but because its very nature is beyond his comprehension of value. I want to protect Pinewood not just from Marcus, but from the idea of Marcus, from anyone who looks at this land and sees only dollar signs. I told him then about Richard's dream, the one we'd shared on the porch under the stars, of the farm becoming an educational center, a legacy for the community. As I spoke, the idea solidified, taking shape from a wispy dream into a concrete plan. William listened, his legal mind whirring. The initial confusion on his face was replaced by a slow, dawning admiration, and then excitement. He began to pace his office, his energy matching my own. A charitable trust, he mused, tapping his chin. A 501c3, an educational foundation. He stopped and pointed a finger at me. Eleanor, that's not just a defense, it's a checkmate. It's a move so far outside the box they're playing in, they won't even see it coming. He grew serious again. But it's a monumental task. Appraisals, bylaws, mission statements, IRS filings, it's a legal labyrinth. And it means you would no longer own Pinewood. You would be giving it away, turning it over to a board of directors, becoming its steward rather than its master. Richard and I were always stewards of that land, Will. We never truly felt we owned it. We were just its caretakers for a time. This is just making it official. It's honoring Richard in a way that's bigger and better than simply winning a fight with his son. A broad, genuine smile finally broke across William's face. He looked energized, excited by the challenge. This is the most creative piece of estate defense I've ever seen, and I know exactly who we need to bring in to quarterback this. A young woman, sharp as a whip. You'll remember her, Sarah Jenkins. Her family has the farm over on the West Ridge. She worked for you one summer, packing apples. I remembered her instantly. A bright, hard-working girl with a quick smile. She's a lawyer now, William continued, already reaching for the phone. Specializes in exact this field. Land preservation, agricultural trusts. She's the best there is. If anyone can help us build this fortress in time, it's her. As he dialed, I looked out the window at the bustling town square. I had walked into this office a grieving widow, armed with a will. I was walking out a founder, armed with a vision. Marcus had declared war on a farmhouse. He had no idea I was about to build a cathedral. Miles away, in a city apartment that smelled of expensive candles and quiet desperation, a different kind of strategy was being formed. It wasn't about honor or legacy. It was about survival. Jessica's survival. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the traffic below, her phone hot against her ear. Her voice was a low, controlled whisper, a stark contrast to the panic turning in her stomach. I understand that, but a real estate deal of this magnitude takes time. The estate has to clear probate. She was lying, of course. She knew just enough legal jargon to sound convincing. You will have your investment back, with a substantial return as promised. I just need you to be patient. The voice on the other end was not patient. It was cold, menacing, and spoke of consequences that had nothing to do with credit scores. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the phone. Don't threaten me, she hissed. You'll get your money. I guarantee it. She hung up, her hands shaking. The life she had carefully curated, the designer clothes, the high-rise apartment, the illusion of success, was a fantasy financed by dangerous people. She had thought her looks and charm were enough to keep her afloat, but she had miscalculated, and now the tide was going out. Marcus Matthews was not just a boyfriend, he was her last, best hope to avoid being dragged under. When he emerged from the bedroom, looking lost and uncertain, she immediately smoothed her features into a mask of loving support. Hey, you?
she said softly, walking over to wrap her arms around him. "I was just thinking about you, about how strong you were yesterday. It must have been so hard." It was hell, Jess. Seeing her look at me like that, like a stranger.
This was her opening. This was her true talent. She could find the hairline crack in a person's ego and expertly wedge it open. She knew Marcus's great wound was his belief that his parents, especially his father, had always seen him as a disappointment, an inconvenient distraction from their real passion, the orchard. "Of course she looked at you like that, baby," Jessica murmured, stroking his hair. "She's trying to make you feel guilty. It's a classic manipulation tactic. She can't stand that you're finally standing up for yourself, that you're refusing to be second best to a piece of property anymore." She led him to the sofa, where her laptop was open. "I was doing some more research," she said, her tone shifting to one of brisk competence. She had spent the last month devouring articles on inheritance law, looking for any precedent, any loophole. "This is what our lawyer was talking about," she said, pointing to the screen. "It's called pretermitted heir status. It argues that even if a will exists, a child is entitled to a share unless they are explicitly and unambiguously disinherited. And even then, it can be challenged if you can prove undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity." The legal terms were a smokescreen. The core of her argument was emotional. "She can't just cut you out, Marcus. It's not right. It's not American. A son is entitled to his father's legacy. It's about more than money. It's about the principle. It's about forcing them to finally acknowledge your place in the family." He was wavering. The coldness in my eyes at the funeral had shaken him more than he let on. A deeply buried part of him, the little boy who just wanted his father's approval, was whispering that this was wrong. Jessica sensed his hesitation and pressed harder. She reframed his greed as a righteous crusade. "Think about it, Marcus. What have they ever really given you? A college education? That was an investment, so you wouldn't embarrass them. They never supported your ideas, your ambitions. They wanted you to be a clone of them, to live and die in the dirt. You are bigger than that. You deserve a life of your own, a life we can build together." She painted a vivid picture of that life. A tech incubator they would fund, apartments in New York and London, a world away from the smell of apple blossoms and manure. It was a glittering, seductive fantasy, designed to appeal to every one of his insecurities and resentments. "What if she fights back hard?" he asked, his voice small. "What if she has a will that says what Dad wrote me in that letter?" Jessica's smile was sharp and predatory. "Then we fight dirty, baby," she said softly. "We question her competence. A 70-year-old woman, grieving, alone, is she really fit to manage a multi-million-dollar agricultural business? We file motion after motion. We bury her in paperwork. We make her life a living hell until she's so exhausted, so beaten down, that giving you half the farm seems like a cheap price to pay for peace. Trust me," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "An old woman's sentimentality is no match for a smart, aggressive legal strategy." She sealed the argument with a kiss, a calculated act of possession that was both a promise and a command. "It's you and me against the world, Marcus. Don't let her win. Don't let them diminish you. Not again." He looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering belief in her eyes. She wasn't just his girlfriend, she was her champion, the only person who seemed to understand his deep-seated sense of injustice. The quiet, nagging voice of his conscience finally fell silent, drowned out by the roar of her ambition. "Okay," he said, his own voice hardening, taking on the metallic edge of her resolve. "Let's get our lawyer on the phone. Let's start the attack." He thought he was taking control of his destiny. He had no idea he was now merely a pawn in Jessica's desperate, high-stakes game, where the orchard wasn't the prize,
but simply the collateral. Marcus knew that a legal assault wasn't enough. He needed inside information. He needed leverage. And he knew exactly where to get it. He needed to talk to Javier. Javier Ramirez was more than a foreman. He was the farm's living history. He'd arrived from Mexico as a young man with nothing but the clothes on his back and a willingness to work. Richard saw his intelligence and integrity, taking him under his wing. Over 30 years, Javier had become Richard's right hand, his most trusted confidant in all matters of the orchard. He had bounced Marcus on his knee as a baby, taught him how to properly prune a tree as a boy, and had slipped him his first beer as a teenager. Their bond was deeper than that of an owner and an employee. It was familial. And Marcus, with Jessica's coaching, was about to weaponize that affection. He chose his moment carefully. A week after the funeral, he drove his rental car out towards the farm, but he didn't take the main road. He used the old service lane that ran along the western perimeter, a dusty track used by tractors and irrigation crews. He parked under the shade of a large oak tree and waited. He knew Javier's crew finished their day at 4, and Javier was always the last to leave, making one final check of the equipment. Right on schedule, Javier's old, beat-up Ford truck came rattling down the lane. He slowed as he saw the unfamiliar car, his brow furrowed with a farmer's natural suspicion of anything out of place. When Marcus stepped out from the shade of the tree, Javier's face went through a rapid series of emotions: shock, confusion, and then a wary, hesitant warmth. "Marquito," Javier said, climbing out of his truck. He wiped his dusty hands on the thighs of his jeans. "What does this? What are you doing out here?" Marcus had rehearsed his lines with Jessica for hours. He needed to project concern, not aggression. He needed to be the prodigal son, worried for his widowed mother. "Javier," he said, pitching his voice with sincerity, "I had to see you. I'm so worried I haven't been able to sleep." Javier's eyes narrowed slightly. The gossip in the small farming community was already swirling about the scene at the funeral. "Worried? About what, Marcus?" "About Mom," Marcus said, taking a step closer, forcing a look of earnest anxiety onto his face. "She's all alone in that big house. Richard handled everything. You know that. The books, the contracts, all of it. Now I'm hearing things. Lawyers are calling her, developers, people who smell an opportunity. I'm terrified they're going to take advantage of her grief, convince her to sell the farm for pennies on the dollar." It was a brilliant, insidious lie. It took the truth, that lawyers were involved, and flipped the narrative entirely, casting himself as the protector and me as the vulnerable target. It was designed specifically to appeal to Javier's deepest loyalty, his sworn duty to protect the family and the farm that Richard had built. The suspicion in Javier's eyes softened. He looked towards the distant farmhouse. "Your mother is a very strong woman, Marcus, and she has William Thompson. He is a good man."
"Will's a great guy, but he's old school," Marcus pressed, gesturing with his hands as if explaining a complex problem. "He doesn't understand these corporate sharks. They'll bury him in paperwork he doesn't understand. Look, I'm trying to help, but she won't listen to me. She thinks, well, you know how things are between us. I'm on the outside. I don't have the real numbers, the true picture of the farm's health. If I'm going to protect her, if I'm going to make sure no one cheats her, I need to know what I'm talking about. I need to know the real value of what we're dealing with. The profits from the last harvest, the details of that new grocery contract Dad was so excited about." He let his voice trail off, letting the implication hang in the air. He wasn't asking for secrets to use against me. He was asking for data to use for me. Javier was conflicted. Every instinct told him this was wrong, that his loyalty was to me, the current owner. But his heart was at war with his head. He was looking at the boy he had practically raised, the boy he still called Marquito. He remembered Richard's pride in Marcus, and also his deep, abiding sorrow over their estrangement. Perhaps, Javier thought,
This was a chance for the boy to finally step up, to do the right thing, to heal the rift. Javier, I cannot, Javier said, but his voice lacked conviction. Your mother, she trusts me. To go behind her back? It's not behind her back. It's for her back. To protect it. Please, Javier, you were like a second father to me. My dad trusted you with his life's work. I'm just asking you to help me honor that trust now that he's gone. Help me protect his wife. Help me protect his legacy. The word legacy was the key. For Javier, protecting Richard's legacy was a sacred oath. The conflict on his weathered face was painful to imagine. He looked at Marcus's pleading eyes, and the little boy he remembered won out over the stranger from the funeral. With a heavy, resigned sigh, Javier's shoulders slumped. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Okay, he said, his voice barely a whisper. A little information, only to help you make sure she is not cheated. He didn't give Marcus account books, but he gave him enough. He confirmed the record-breaking tonnage from the previous fall's harvest. He explained the basics of the new distribution deal I had negotiated, a deal that significantly increased their profit margins. He gave Marcus the ammunition his lawyer needed to paint a picture of a thriving multi-million-dollar enterprise. He gave him the numbers that would be used to argue that denying Marcus his share was not just unfair, but a grave financial injury. As Marcus drove away down the dusty track, a triumphant smile spread across his face. It had been easier than he thought. He had played on old loyalties like a master musician, and Javier had sung exactly the tune he wanted to hear. Javier stood by his truck, watching the dust settle, a cold, sick feeling coiling in his stomach. He had just betrayed the trust of two people, one living, one dead. He told himself it was for the right reasons, but the bitter taste of deceit was already in his mouth. He had opened a door he could never again close, and he prayed to God that he hadn't just unleashed a monster. While Marcus was busy laying siege to my world, I was in the war room, designing a new one. The meeting with Sarah Jenkins took place the very next day in William's office. When she walked in, the room seemed to brighten. She had the same determined chin I remembered from her teenage years, but now her eyes held the sharp, focused intelligence of a seasoned lawyer. She was dressed in a practical, professional suit, but she still carried the grounded, no-nonsense air of someone who understands the land. She shook my hand, her grip firm and warm. Mrs. Matthews, it's an honor to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances. I was so sorry to hear about Richard. He was one of the kindest men I've ever known. He taught me that a person's worth isn't in what they own, but in what they build. His words, so simple and true, were a balm to my raw nerves. This wasn't just a hired gun. This was an ally. This was someone who understood. We sat around William's large mahogany table, the air thick with purpose. I laid out everything: the scene at the funeral, Richard's letter, and most importantly, my burgeoning idea. Not just to defend the farm, but to transform it. I spoke of Richard's dream of creating a live-in legacy, a place of learning and growth that would serve the community long after we were all gone. I talked about wanting to build something so fundamentally good that it would stand as a permanent rebuke to Marcus's shallow greed. She listened with an intensity that was almost unnerving. She didn't interrupt. She didn't take notes. She just watched my face, her gaze never wavering, absorbing not just the facts, but the emotion, the vision behind them. When she finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Sarah leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. Eleanor, that is the most beautiful and powerful estate plan I have ever heard. And it's not just a defense. It's an act of creation. It's an answer to greed that isn't about fighting, but about building something better. Her validation was like a dam breaking. The fear and uncertainty I had been holding back washed away, replaced by a surge of pure, unadulterated purpose. But, she continued, her tone becoming brisk and practical, William is right. This is a legal and logistical mountain, and Marcus's lawsuit has started a clock. We have to have the trust legally incorporated, the board established, and the entire 1,500-acre property deeded over before you set foot in that courtroom. Any hint of this getting out before it's a done deal could allow them to file an injunction and tie us up in court for years. And so began the most intense weeks of my life. My quiet days of grief were replaced by a whirlwind of activity. The three of us, the veteran lawyer, the young expert, and the grieving widow, became a clandestine council of war. Sarah was the architect. She worked with a ferocious efficiency, drafting the intricate bylaws and the lengthy, jargon-filled application for 501c3 status from the IRS. We spent hours debating the mission statement, honing every word until it perfectly reflected our vision. We named it the Matthews Center for Agricultural Heritage. William was the engineer. He handled the massive task of preparing the estate for transfer. He hired surveyors and appraisers who worked discreetly during off hours. The numbers that came back were staggering, a testament to a lifetime of shrewd investment and backbreaking labor. Seeing the valuation on paper, I understood the source of Marcus's avarice, but it only strengthened my resolve to place it beyond the reach of mere commerce.
My role was to provide the soul. I became the historian, the storyteller. I spent my evenings at the kitchen table, writing down the history of Pinewood. I documented the farming techniques Richard had developed, the stories of droughts and floods we had weathered, the oral history of the land that had been passed down from my own father. This narrative would become the core of the center's curriculum. I also began the outreach, making quiet, confidential calls to trusted friends at the local university and in the school system, laying the groundwork for future partnerships. The pressure was immense. The legal documents were bewildering. The constant secrecy was draining. There were moments of doubt that crept in during the lonely hours of the night. Was I strong enough for this? Was I dishonoring Richard by not simply using his will, the weapon he had given me? One evening, I confessed my doubts to Sarah during a late-night phone call. "I feel like I'm trying to build a ship in a bottle during a hurricane," I told her, my voice weary. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Eleanor, 6 years ago, your son slapped you and broke your heart. A lesser woman would have crumbled. A week ago, he tried to humiliate you at your husband's funeral. A lesser woman would be consumed by rage and revenge. You are doing neither. You are transforming your pain into a gift for generations of people you will never meet. That's not weakness. That is the very definition of strength. Richard would be so incredibly proud." Her words were the steel I needed for my spine. Meanwhile, the attacks from Marcus's side intensified. Formal letters from his lawyer arrived almost daily, filled with escalating threats and demands. William handled them all with a masterful, frustratingly polite stonewalling that bought us precious days, then weeks. The phone calls from Marcus continued as well. They were no longer pleading, but angry and demanding. "This is your last chance, Mother," he said during one call, his voice tight with frustration. "Davies is preparing to file a motion questioning your mental competence. Do you really want your private life dragged through the mud in a public courtroom?" "My life is an open book, Marcus," I replied calmly. "Is yours?" I hung up, my hands steady. The threats no longer frightened me. They were the desperate howls of a wolf who senses his prey is no longer afraid. He thought he was laying siege to a vulnerable farmhouse. He had no idea that inside we were forging the steel gates of an unbreachable fortress. And with every threat he made, the walls grew higher and the foundation grew deeper. The first direct legal assault came a month before the final court date. It was a calculated, vicious move, designed to break my spirit. Mr. Davies, Marcus's lawyer, filed a formal motion with the court, a document dripping with false concern and legal poison. The motion was titled, Petition for the appointment of a temporary conservator for the estate of Richard Matthews. William read it to me over the phone, his voice tight with controlled anger. The document painted me as a fragile, grieving, and incompetent elderly woman overwhelmed by the complexities of managing a major agricultural corporation. It cited my advanced age and recent emotional trauma as risk factors for unsound financial judgment. And using the very numbers Javier had so foolishly provided, it argued that the estate's high value made it imperative for the court to intervene to protect the assets from my mismanagement. The final venomous paragraph requested that the court appoint a temporary co-conservator to oversee all financial decisions of the estate until the inheritance dispute was resolved. The suggested appointee, of course, was Marcus. "He's trying to have me declared senile," I said, my voice a low, dangerous whisper. The audacity of it, the sheer, breathtaking cruelty, left me momentarily speechless. This wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. This was an attempt to strip me of my dignity, my autonomy, my very identity. "It's a disgusting tactic, Eleanor," William said, his fury palpable even through the phone line. "It's a classic bully move. They want to scare you into a quick settlement. We will fight this with everything we have." We went to a preliminary hearing on the motion the following week. I sat beside William, my back ramrod straight, as Davies made his case. He spoke of me with a kind of pitying condescension that made my blood boil, referring to me as the bereaved widow and emphasizing the crushing burden of the estate. Judge Miller, the same stern-faced man who would preside over the final hearing, listened impassively. He was no fool. He saw the tactic for what it was. He denied the request to appoint Marcus as a conservator, a small victory that made Davies's face tighten in annoyance. However, to show due diligence, the judge did issue a minor procedural order. He ruled that, given the size of the estate, I would be required to submit a weekly summary of all income and major expenditures to the court for review until the main hearing. It was a small thing, a procedural hoop to jump through, but in the twisted narrative of Marcus and Jessica, it was a monumental triumph. I was walking out of the hardware store a few days later when my phone rang. It was Marcus, his voice practically crowing with victory. "So, did you get the news, Mother?" he gloated. "The judge is on my side. He sees you can't handle things on your own. He's put you on an allowance." "That is a gross mischaracterization of the ruling, Marcus, and you know it," I said, my voice cold as ice. "Is it?" he taunted. "You have to report your spending to him. He's watching you. Davy says it's the beginning of the end. He says this proves our point about your incompetence. We've got you cornered." I could hear Jessica's shrill laughter in the background. "We're sending over a final settlement offer. I highly suggest you take it. It's the last olive branch you're going to get." I hung up the phone, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my old truck. The rage was a hot metallic taste in my mouth. They were celebrating. They were popping champagne, convinced their bullying had worked, that this tiny procedural ruling was a sign of my impending collapse. The settlement offer that arrived via courier the next day was the embodiment of their arrogance. It was a document of my complete and total surrender. It magnanimously granted me lifetime residency in the home Richard and I had built with our own hands, as if I were a tenant they were choosing not to evict. It offered me a paltry annual stipend, less than what we paid our junior farm hands. In exchange, Marcus would receive immediately the title to 750 acres of his choosing and a 51% controlling interest in the ongoing business. I read it, then I walked to my fireplace, struck a match, and watched the insulting document burn to black, curling ashes. The final weeks were a blur of frantic, secret activity. I dutifully submitted my weekly financial reports to the court, every number precise, every expenditure accounted for. To the outside world, I was a widow going about her business, complying with the court's order. Behind the scenes, we were in a desperate sprint to the finish line. The final trust documents were signed and notarized on my kitchen table.
Sarah worked her contacts at the state capitol, hand-carrying the paperwork through the bureaucracy to get the final registration stamp. The new deed transferring ownership of Pinewood Orchard from Eleanor Matthews to the Matthews Center for Agricultural Heritage was drawn up.
The night before the court date, we held our final meeting. The three of us sat in William's office, the signed, stamped, and legally unimpeachable deed lying in the center of the table. It was done. The fortress was built. The transfer was complete. "They have no idea," Sarah said, a look of fierce joy in her eyes. "They're going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow armed for a fistfight, and they're going to find themselves standing in the middle of an ocean." I went home that night, and I slept. For the first time in months, I slept a deep, dreamless sleep. Let them have their illusion of victory. Let them swagger into court, puffed up with pride and greed. The most devastating defeats are always delivered to those who believe they have already won. The air in courtroom 4B was stale and heavy with the ghosts of 1,000 other family tragedies. It was a grand, intimidating room with high ceilings and dark wood paneling designed to make you feel the weight of the law. As I walked down the center aisle, flanked by William and Sarah, I felt a tremor of pure adrenaline, but no fear. I had grieved. I had planned. Now, I was ready. I wore the same simple navy blue suit from my first meeting with William. It felt like my armor. Marcus, Jessica, and their lawyer, Mr. Davies, were already seated at the plaintiff's table. They were a portrait of smug confidence. Marcus wore an expensive-looking charcoal suit, a stark contrast to the work clothes he'd despised his whole life. He looked less like a farmer's son, and more like the corporate raider he aspired to be. Jessica was beside him, dressed in a severe black dress, her posture rigid, her eyes scanning the room with a look of triumphant disdain. When she saw me, a small, cruel smile touched her lips. Marcus just gave me a curt, dismissive nod. It was the nod of a victor to the vanquished. I took my seat, arranging my skirt, and met his gaze with a calm I didn't know I possessed. The surprise that flickered in his eyes was my first small taste of satisfaction. He had expected to see a broken old woman. He was not prepared for the quiet composure that met him. The public gallery was sparsely populated, but the faces there mattered. My friends, Tom and Martha Peterson, gave me a small, encouraging wave. And in the very back row, huddled in the corner as if trying to make himself invisible, was Javier. He looked as though he hadn't slept in weeks. His face was pale and haggard, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, were filled with a profound and bottomless shame. He had come to witness the consequences of his actions. "All rise," the bailiff's voice echoed, and Judge Miller swept in, his black robes flowing behind him. He settled himself at the bench, his face a mask of stern neutrality. He surveyed the room over the top of his reading glasses, his expression that of a man who had little patience for theatrics. "Mr. Davies," the judge said, his voice dry, "you may proceed." Davies rose with the fluid grace of a seasoned performer. He approached the judge, his hands clasped behind his back, the very picture of reasoned authority. His opening statement was a masterclass in manipulation. He began by painting a sympathetic portrait of Marcus, the devoted only son, who had returned home in a time of grief, only to be met with a cold and inexplicable hostility. He spoke of Richard's life's work, framing Pinewood not as a home or a legacy, but as a highly profitable, multi-million-dollar agricultural asset. "Your Honor," Davies intoned, his voice resonating with carefully rehearsed sincerity, "we are not here today out of greed. We are here seeking justice, the justice of a son's natural right to inherit from his father, a right that is unjustly, and we believe unwisely, denied by the defendant, Mrs. Matthews." He gestured towards me with a look of profound pity. "Our request is simple and equitable, a 50% share of the estate for the sole heir, Mr. Matthews.
This will allow him to take his rightful place in his father's legacy and ensure the continued prosperity of this valuable enterprise for years to come. He went on for nearly 40 minutes, his words weaving a compelling, poisonous narrative. He was casting me as a stubborn, sentimental, and slightly incompetent old woman, clinging irrationally to the past, while Marcus was the forward-thinking, unfairly maligned hero. With every word, I could see Marcus visibly straighten, his expression growing more self-righteous. Jessica looked as if she was about to burst with triumph. When Davies finally concluded and returned to his seat with a confident smirk on his lips, the judge turned his impassive gaze to our table. "Mr. Thompson, your response?" William stood up. He was not a showman like Davies. He was a quiet, methodical craftsman of the law. He buttoned his old, well-worn suit jacket, took a moment to clean his glasses with a handkerchief, and then approached the bench. The deliberate slowness of his movements seemed to suck the theatrical energy out of the room, replacing it with a quiet, intense focus. "Your Honor," William began, his voice calm and steady, the voice of a man who holds all the cards. "Mr. Davies has presented a compelling narrative. It's a story filled with emotion and what appears to be sound legal reasoning. It is, however, entirely irrelevant." A murmur went through the courtroom. Davies frowned, annoyed at the dismissal of his grand performance. "It is irrelevant, Your Honor," William continued, his voice gaining strength, "because the entire case presented by the plaintiff rests on one single foundational premise, that Pinewood Orchard is a private asset belonging to the estate of my client's late husband. And that premise, Your Honor, is factually and legally incorrect." The air in courtroom crackled with a sudden, sharp confusion. I saw Marcus lean over and whisper furiously to Davies, who just gave a slight, irritated shake of his head, clearly believing William was bluffing, engaging in some sort of desperate legal rhetoric. Judge Miller, however, was not irritated. He was intrigued. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on William. "Elaborate, counselor." "It would be my distinct pleasure, Your Honor." He turned to our table where Sarah handed him a thick, professionally bound document. It was beautiful, with a simple, elegant cover that read, "The Matthews Center for Agricultural Heritage." William walked to the clerk's station and formally submitted the document as evidence. "Your Honor, I present to the court the fully executed and state-registered Articles of Incorporation, bylaws, and deed of transfer for the Matthews Center for Agricultural Heritage, a federally recognized 501c3 nonprofit educational foundation." The name, the legal terminology, it all landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. I watched Davies' face. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. He looked at the document, then back at William, as if his brain was refusing to process what he was hearing.
William's voice, calm and relentless, filled the stunned silence. 10 days ago, on July 19th of this year, my client, Mrs. Eleanor Matthews, acting in her legal capacity as the sole beneficiary and executor of the estate of Richard Matthews, signed over the deed to the entire 1,500-acre property known as Pinewood Orchard, including all land, buildings, equipment, and ongoing business concerns, to this new legal entity. He turned his body slightly, a gesture that for the first time seemed to include Marcus and Jessica in his audience. Therefore, the asset which Mr. Matthews is attempting to claim a share of no longer belongs to his mother. It does not, in fact, belong to any individual. It belongs to the center. Its stated and legally binding mission is to serve the public good through education in agricultural history and sustainable farming practices. As a charitable foundation, its assets cannot be sold for profit. They cannot be divided. They cannot be leveraged for personal gain. Any and all profits from the orchard's operations are now legally mandated to be reinvested into the center's educational and community programs. He let the words hang in the air. The silence that followed was profound. It was the sound of a world being turned upside down, the sound of a meticulously planned heist running into a solid brick wall that had materialized out of nowhere. I finally allowed myself to look directly at my son. The color had drained from his face, leaving it a sickly grayish white. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. He was staring at me, his mouth slightly agape, his eyes wide with the dawning catastrophic understanding of what I had done. He had come for money, for property, for something he could sell. I had transformed it into something that could only be given away. Beside him, Jessica's composure had completely disintegrated. Her face was a twisted mask of rage and panic. Her carefully planned future, her escape from her debts, had just vanished. I could almost see the numbers scrolling behind her eyes, the calculations of her own ruin. Davies finally found his voice, sputtering with outrage. Your Honor, this is a sham, a mockery of the legal process. It's a last-ditch bad faith transfer of assets designed solely to defraud a legitimate heir of his rightful inheritance. Judge Miller, who had been silently reading the first few pages of the document, looked up, his expression grim. Is this document legally binding and properly registered with the state, Mr. Thompson? It is, Your Honor. It is, Your Honor. It is ironclad. From a legal standpoint, Pinewood Orchard, the asset at the heart of this dispute, ceased to be a part of the Matthews estate 10 days ago. The plaintiff is suing to claim a piece of something that, in the eyes of the law, no longer exists in a form that can be claimed. Just as the judge was about to speak, a commotion came from the back of the room. A choked, desperate voice called out, "Your Honor!" Everyone turned. It was Javier. He was on his feet, his hands trembling, his face a mess of shame and resolve. He said, "Your Honor, please, I must speak." His voice cracked. Judge Miller looked at him sternly. "State your name for the record." "Javier Ramirez, Your Honor. I was the foreman at Pinewood Orchard for 32 years. He took a deep, shuddering breath and looked directly at me, his eyes pleading for forgiveness I didn't know if I could give. "I have to confess, I helped him. He came to me. He lied to me. He said he was worried for his mother, that lawyers were trying to cheat her. He asked me for financial information to protect her. I believed him. I gave him the numbers about the harvest, about the contracts. I thought I was helping the family. I see now I was just a fool, a tool for his greed." Javier's voice broke. Richard Matthews was a brother to me, and I have dishonored his memory. I am so sorry, Eleanor, so sorry. Javier's confession was a moral thunderclap. It didn't change the legal outcome, but it obliterated any shred of sympathy anyone might have had for Marcus. It laid bare the rotten foundation of his entire case. Judge Miller looked from Javier's anguished face to Marcus's stunned, ashen silence, and to Jessica's barely contained fury. He had seen enough. He took off his glasses, polished them slowly, and put them back on. His gaze was like chips of ice. He looked at Davies. "Counselor, given that the asset your client is suing for is no longer part of the defendant's estate, your case appears to be moot." Then he looked at Marcus. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something beyond judicial neutrality. It was contempt. He picked up his gavel. "This court finds no legal basis for the plaintiff's claim. Case dismissed." Crack. The sound of the gavel was the loudest, most final sound I had ever heard.
It was the sound of a door slamming shut, the sound of a war ending. It was the sound of my victory. We didn't stay to watch the fallout. As soon as the judge left the bench, William put a steadying hand on my elbow and guided Sarah and me towards a side door, shielding me from the sudden buzz of reporters who had gotten wind of the verdict. But the sounds from the courtroom followed us down the marble hallway, the shriek of a chair being pushed back, and a woman's voice, high and venomous, cutting through the murmurs. "You useless fool! You told me it was a sure thing! You told me you had her!" Jessica's voice screeched, the sound echoing unnaturally. The door swung shut, cutting off Marcus's stammering reply. The ugly, bitter implosion of their poisoned partnership was a fitting postscript to the day's events. I learned later that their argument had spilled out onto the courthouse steps, a public, humiliating spectacle that ended with Jessica getting into a taxi and leaving Marcus standing alone, a man who had, in the space of an hour, lost his inheritance, his co-conspirator, and his last shred of self-respect. The story was front-page news in the local paper for a week. The narrative was a simple one, a David and Goliath tale that the community embraced. Grieving widow outsmarts greedy son, turns family farm into public trust. My phone rang off the hook. Friends, neighbors, even the mayor called to offer their congratulations. They saw it as a triumphant, feel-good story. But for me, the victory tasted of ash. Every congratulation was a reminder that I had been forced to publicly vanquish my own child. I had saved my home, but in doing so, I had to formally acknowledge that my family was broken beyond repair. Life at the newly christened Matthews Center for Agricultural Heritage became my salvation. It was a whirlwind of positive, forward-moving activity. Sarah, as the new executive director, was a force of nature. Her passion and energy were contagious. We assembled a board of directors, a mix of wise old farmers and bright young academics. We launched our website. We started clearing out one of the old barns to convert it into a classroom and visitor center. The farm, which had been a place of quiet grief, was suddenly alive with new sounds. The chatter of volunteers, the enthusiastic questions of university students who came to study our soil, the distinct rumble of a school bus bringing the first group of elementary school children for a tour. Seeing their small faces light up with wonder as they picked their first apple or saw a beehive up close was a healing balm on my bruised soul. This was Richard's dream, blooming into a reality more vibrant than either of us had ever dared to imagine.
The seasons turned. Summer faded into a spectacular autumn. The harvest was bountiful. The pain of the court battle began to recede, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work. I never heard from Marcus. Not a word. I told myself it was for the best. I told myself I didn't care. But in the quiet moments, late at night, the question would surface. A painful, maternal ache. Was he safe? Was he homeless? Had he learned anything at all? I tried to push the thoughts away. He was a grown man who had made his choices. He was no longer my responsibility. But a mother's heart is a stubborn, illogical organ. Then, one cold gray afternoon in late November, I was walking back to the house from the main barn. I saw a figure standing by the main gate, near the new, beautifully carved wooden sign that announced our name to the world. The man was just standing there, staring at the sign, his posture slumped in the thin, worn jacket he wore against the biting wind. My heart stopped, then started again with a painful thud. Even from a distance, I knew. It was Marcus. He looked like a wraith. He was shockingly thin, his face gaunt and shadowed with a scruffy beard. The expensive suit and arrogant swagger were gone, replaced by the hollowed-out look of a man who has been thoroughly and completely broken by the world. I walked towards him slowly, my mind a chaotic jumble of emotions. Anger warred with a deep, unwelcome pity. He heard my footsteps on the gravel and looked up. His eyes, when they met mine, were no longer cold or arrogant. They were empty, defeated. He had lost everything. The story had come out piece by piece. Jessica, true to her nature, had disappeared, but not before saddling him with the mountain of debt she had accumulated in their name. The people she owed were not forgiving. They had taken everything Marcus had left. He had been working odd jobs, sleeping in his car, until that, too, was repossessed. He had hit the bottom of the abyss he had dug for himself. He didn't speak. He couldn't seem to find the words. He just looked at me, at the home that was no longer his to claim, and his face, for the first time since he was a child, crumpled. A dry, ragged sob escaped his lips. He had nowhere else to go. Wasn't an apology, wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was the simple, devastating truth. He hadn't come back out of remorse. He had come back because he was desperate, because the world had chewed him up and spit him out, and this was the only place left to run. The question that faced me then was harder than any legal battle. The court had tested my strength and my cunning. This broken man, my son, was now testing my capacity for grace, and I honestly did not know if I had any left to give. I stood there on the gravel drive, the cold November wind whipping around us, and looked at the stranger who was my son. The anger I had held on to for so long felt heavy and useless. The triumphant satisfaction of my victory felt hollow. All I saw was a broken man, shivering in a thin jacket with nowhere else in the world to go. I didn't offer a hug. I didn't speak words of comfort. The chasm between us was too wide, carved too deep by years of resentment and a final, brutal betrayal. But I couldn't leave him there. Some primal maternal instinct, buried under layers of hurt and resolve, refused to let me. I pointed towards the small rustic cabin set back in a grove of pine trees by the creek. It was simple, just a room and a small bathroom, a place we kept for visiting researchers or interns. "The cabin is unlocked," I said, my voice flat and emotionless. "There's wood for the stove on the porch. You can stay there." He looked at me, his eyes wide with a flicker of disbelief, as if he expected me to slam the door in his face. "But," I added, my voice hardening slightly, "nothing in this world is free. You should know that by now. The center needs winter prep work done. Fences to be mended, firewood to be chopped and stacked for the main house. If you want to eat, you will work. Talk to Javier in the morning. He will be your boss." I turned and walked back to the house without another word, not looking back. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't dare to see the expression in them. I had offered him shelter, not sanctuary, a job, not a welcome. It was all I could give. The weeks that followed were a strange, silent dance. I would see him from a distance, a solitary figure working near the fence line, his movements slow and deliberate. He worked hard. I had to give him that. He, who had always despised physical labor, now spent his days in the cold, his hands, once soft, growing calloused and rough. He did the work without complaint. He reported to Javier each morning, took his instructions with a quiet "yes, sir," and ate his meals alone in the small cabin. He was a ghost on the periphery of my life. I would see him from my kitchen window, and a painful knot would tighten in my chest. He was so close, and yet a universe away. We never spoke. When our paths occasionally crossed on the farm, he would avert his eyes.
his face a mask of shame, and I would walk on, my own face a mask of cool neutrality. Javier was the bridge. A quiet, forgiving man, he treated Marcus with a reserved dignity. He didn't mention the past, he simply gave Marcus his work for the day and treated him as he would any other hand. It was Javier who told me one evening that Marcus had fixed the old troublesome generator in the main barn, a task that had stumped even him. "He has his father's hands for engines," Javier said, a note of wonder in his voice. A month passed. Then two. The snows came, blanketing the orchard in a thick layer of white. The work slowed. One morning, I woke to find the path from my back door to the woodshed shoveled clear of a foot of fresh snow, and the woodshed itself stacked high with neatly split logs. I knew who had done it. He had left no note. He had made no announcement. It was a silent act of service. A few days later, I found a plain white envelope on my doorstep, tucked under the welcome mat. It was not a legal document. It was a letter. My name was written on the front in his handwriting, the same messy scrawl I remembered from his childhood. My hands trembled as I carried it inside. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I planned my war against him, and I opened it. The letter was long. Several pages, written on cheap-lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. "Mom," it began, "I don't have the right to call you that, but I don't know what else to write. For 2 months, I've been living on this land, and for the first time in my life, I think I'm finally seeing it. Not as a property, not as an asset, but as a living thing."
I spend my days mending the fences Richard built. I can see where he made the repairs over the years, where he used a different kind of wire, a different technique. It's like a history book written in wood and steel. I chop the wood from trees he probably planted. I am living inside his work, and I finally understand. It wasn't just a job for him. It was a form of love. I was so wrong. About everything. I was a black hole of entitlement, sucking everything towards myself, convinced the world owed me something. I was jealous of this place. I hated it because I felt it got the love that should have been mine. I wanted to hurt it, to sell it, to prove that I was more valuable than it was. What a fool I was. A blind, arrogant fool. When I stood on the courthouse steps, alone, with nothing, I didn't just feel defeated, I felt erased. Everything I had built my identity on, money, ambition, Jessica, it was all gone, and there was nothing left underneath. I came back here because I had nowhere else to go. But being here has been something else. It's been a punishment, yes, but it's also been a kind of education. I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I don't deserve it. Maybe I never will. I'm not writing this to ask for anything. I just needed to say it. I needed you to know that the son who hurt you so badly is beginning to understand the depth of his own stupidity. What you did, turning the farm into the center, was an act of genius and grace. You saved it from me. You saved Dad's soul. I am, for the first time in my life, so incredibly proud to be your son, even if I am not worthy of the title. Marcus. I let the letter fall to the table. The tears that came were different this time. They weren't tears of grief or rage. They were the tears of a long frozen winter finally beginning to thaw. The next morning, I baked a loaf of apple cinnamon bread, the kind he had loved as a boy. I poured hot coffee into a large thermos. I put it all in a basket, and pulling on my heavy coat, I walked down the snow-covered path to the cabin by the creek. He was outside, splitting logs with a focused, rhythmic swing of the axe. He stopped, startled, as I approached, his breath pluming in the cold air. I didn't say a word. I just walked up to the steps, to the small porch, set the basket down, and took out 2 mugs. I poured the coffee, the steam rising like a prayer into the cold, still air, and I handed one mug to him. He took it, his calloused, dirty fingers brushing against mine. He looked from the mug to my face, his eyes filled with a question he dare not ask. I just nodded towards the top step. I sat down, and after a moment's hesitation, he sat down too, a careful distance between us. We sat there in silence for a long time, watching the sun sparkle on the snow, the warmth of the coffee cups seeping into our hands. The silence wasn't angry or awkward. It was quiet. It was peaceful. It was the first day of a new, uncertain season. I don't know if our family can ever be fully whole again. Trust, once shattered, is a mosaic pieced together one tiny, fragile shard at a time. But as I sat there, sharing a quiet moment with my son, I looked out at the orchard, at the sleeping trees waiting for spring, at the legacy we had built, and I felt a sense of hope. Not a guarantee, but a possibility. The land that had been the source of our deepest division had, through an act of letting go, become the very ground on which we might finally learn to heal.